In November of 2025, investigators in Elmira, New York, gathered at the grave of a man who had been dead for more than 20 years. They weren't there because of something recently discovered in his home. They weren't following a confession. And his name hadn't suddenly appeared in some forgotten police report. They were there because of something far smaller. A microscopic trace of biological evidence preserved from the clothing of a 12-year-old girl murdered more than 6 decades earlier. For almost 62 years, detectives had searched for the person who killed Mary Theresa Simpson. They interviewed hundreds of people, they followed leads, they reviewed suspects. The case file eventually grew to thousands of pages. But the man investigators were now preparing to exhume had apparently never been part of that investigation at all. His name wasn't buried somewhere deep inside the old paperwork. Police say it wasn't there. And by the time science finally led them to him, he could no longer answer a single question. So investigators did something the original detectives in 1964 could never have imagined. They opened his grave. Because if the DNA inside his remains matched the evidence saved from Mary Theresa Simpson's clothing, a mystery that had survived for almost 62 years might finally have a name. But to understand how police reached that grave, you have to go back to a Sunday evening in March of 1964. Back to a 12-year-old girl who was simply trying to get home. Her name was Mary Theresa Simpson. She lived in Elmira, New York, and the people who remembered her did not remember her as the center of a murder investigation. They remembered a child. Mary was described as shy, but active. She and her older sister Linda grew up playing with other neighborhood children. They played kick the can. They roller skated on the old metal skates that clamped onto shoes and tightened with a key. They spent time at the neighborhood house and took part in activities together. Mary was the kind of child whose life was filled with ordinary things. Family, school, friends, places she expected to visit again. And on Sunday, March 15th, 1964, nothing about the beginning of her day suggested that those ordinary things were about to disappear. That afternoon, Mary left home to visit relatives. Several hours later, she began making her way back. At around 6:30 in the evening, she was seen near East Market and Harriet Streets on Elmira's east side. She was believed to be walking toward home. It became the last confirmed sighting of Mary Theresa Simpson alive. As the evening grew later, Mary still hadn't returned. Her father became worried. Later that night, he contacted police and reported his 12-year-old daughter missing. Officers and family members began searching. They checked with relatives and people who knew her. Investigators tried to reconstruct Mary's movements and determine whether someone had seen her after she passed through the area around Market and Harriet Streets. But somewhere between that intersection and home, Mary's trail disappeared. There was no confirmed sighting explaining where she went next, no witness who could tell police who she may have encountered, and no immediate clue pointing toward the person responsible. One night passed, then another. Searchers continued looking throughout Elmira and the surrounding area, but Mary remained missing. Then, 4 days after she disappeared, the search moved to a wooded area outside the city. On March 19th, Mary's body was discovered near Combs Hill Road in Southport. She had been concealed beneath debris, branches, dirt, and heavy rocks. The heaviest stone placed over the area was later described as weighing roughly 110 pounds. Mary was still clothed. Investigators determined that she had suffered sexual trauma. Her death was ruled a homicide, with authorities describing the cause as asphyxiation associated with choking or strangulation. The search for a missing child was over. The search for her killer had begun. Police processed the area and collected what they believed might matter: Mary's clothing, her personal belongings, physical traces from the scene. In 1964, investigators had no way of knowing how important those decisions would become. Profiling did not exist as a practical forensic tool. There was no genetic database capable of turning biological material into a name. Investigators could examine stains, fibers, fingerprints, witness accounts, and physical evidence. But there were limits to what the science of 1964 could tell them. Still, they saved the evidence. And that decision would become one of the most important developments in the entire case. The investigation expanded. Police interviewed relatives, neighbors, people who had seen Mary that Sunday, individuals whose histories made them worth examining. Leads were followed. Possible suspects were considered. Over the years, hundreds of interviews were conducted, yet nothing gave investigators what they needed. There was no arrest, no prosecution, and no publicly established connection between Mary and the person who had attacked her. Months became years. Years became decades. Detectives retired. New investigators inherited the case. Mary's family grew older. But the evidence remained, and eventually science began catching up with what detectives had preserved. By the early 2000s, investigators were able to return to Mary's clothing with forensic techniques that hadn't existed when she was killed. Testing produced male DNA evidence. For the first time, police had something extraordinarily valuable, a genetic profile that could potentially belong to the person responsible. There was just one problem. They still didn't have a name. Investigators searched law enforcement DNA systems. No identifying match appeared. Further testing was conducted years later. Still nothing. It was a strange position for detectives to be in. The killer may have left part of his biological identity behind in 1964. Police had finally learned how to read it. But the databases couldn't tell them who he was. And that meant the case reached another dead end. For years, that unidentified male profile remained exactly that. Unidentified, but technology continued advancing. And eventually, investigators gained access to an entirely different way of searching. Instead of asking whether the unknown profile directly matched someone already stored in a criminal database. Forensic genetic genealogy could search for people who shared parts of the unknown person's DNA. Relatives, sometimes distant relatives. From those genetic connections, investigators could begin constructing family trees. And instead of waiting for Mary's killer to appear in a database himself, they might be able to reach him through his family. In 2022, Elmira police obtained funding from the nonprofit Season of Justice to pursue advanced forensic testing. But there was another problem. There was almost nothing left to work with. The critical sample contained approximately 0.4 nanograms of DNA, an amount so small it couldn't be seen with the naked eye. And DNA testing can consume the material being analyzed. If the attempt failed, investigators feared there might not be enough evidence left for another one. After almost 60 years, the case had effectively reached a single scientific gamble. The sample was carefully packed in dry ice and sent toward a specialized laboratory in Texas. And then, something happened that almost destroyed the opportunity before the testing even began. The package traveled through Memphis, Tennessee at the same time. A severe ice storm shut down the FedEx hub there. The shipment became stranded. Investigators didn't know how long the dry ice protecting the evidence would last. Think about what was inside that package. Evidence collected from a murdered child in 1964, preserved through generation after generation of investigators. Evidence that had survived for nearly 6 decades. And now, during one of the final journeys of the case, it was sitting somewhere inside a massive closed shipping facility. If the sample was compromised, there might be no replacement. FBI personnel in Memphis were contacted. An agent searched for the package inside the hub. Eventually, it was located and placed inside an FBI freezer where it could be protected until shipping operations resumed. The evidence had survived again. And when the storm passed, the sample finally reached Autham's laboratory in Texas. There, scientists faced the challenge investigators had been worried about. Could they build a usable genealogical profile from such a tiny amount of material? They could. The resulting DNA profile opened a door that had been closed since 1964. But it did not simply produce the killer's name. Now came the genealogy. Investigators examined genetic relationships and began constructing extended family trees. Birth records, marriage records, obituaries, generations of relatives. Every possible connection had to be evaluated. A DNA relationship alone wasn't enough. Investigators also had to ask whether a possible candidate was the correct age, whether he had lived in the correct area, and whether he could realistically have been in Elmira when Mary disappeared. Slowly, the tree narrowed. Eventually, investigators reached a living man whose role in the investigation was very different from the person they were searching for. He wasn't accused of hurting Mary. Instead, investigators believed the unknown DNA contributor might have been his biological father. They asked him for a voluntary DNA sample. He agreed, and the result changed the investigation. Testing supported a paternal relationship. The unidentified DNA contributor was consistent with being this man's biological father. After more than 60 years, investigators could finally move one generation upward, toward a man who had lived right there in Elmira. Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. Murray had been in his early 30s when Mary was killed. He had served in the United States Army during the 1950s. He later worked as a truck driver, including work connected with Mayflower van lines. He lived in the Elmira area. He raised a family there. He was not someone investigators had just discovered living hundreds of miles away under another identity. He had spent much of his life in the same community where Mary disappeared. And yet police said something remarkable about him. His name did not appear in the thousands of pages that had accumulated in Mary's case. He hadn't simply been questioned in 1964 and forgotten. He wasn't an old suspect detectives had finally decided to test. As investigators and the Criminal Investigation Resource Center at Russell Sage College reviewed and organized the enormous case file, Murray appeared to be absent from it. For almost 62 years, police had been searching through the people connected to Mary's investigation. Dina had now led them to someone outside it. And when detectives began looking into Murray's background, they found another troubling detail. Authorities said his history included repeated criminal involvement involving offenses against children. Historical reporting also described earlier allegations involving children. Those reports did not prove he murdered Mary. Police still needed forensic evidence for that. But after genealogy had independently pointed investigators toward Murray, his background gave them another reason to examine him closely. There was only one major obstacle left. Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. was dead. He had died in March of 2004, more than 20 years before investigators finally reached his name. The son's Dina had created a powerful lead, but police wanted something more conclusive. They wanted a direct comparison between Murray himself and the biological evidence preserved from Mary's clothing. That meant investigators needed Dina from his remains. They sought court authorization. And on November 5th, 2025, Alfred Raymond Murray Jr.'s grave was opened. After more than 6 decades of detective work, the investigation had reached the moment no one in 1964 could have predicted. Biological samples were recovered from Murray's remains. They were sent for comparison. And investigators waited. The genealogy had pointed toward his family. His son's Dina had pointed toward his father. But this test could answer the question directly. Was Alfred Raymond Murray Jr., the man whose biological material had been preserved with Mary Theresa Simpson's evidence for more than 60 years? The results came back. It matched. Authorities reported that the probability of selecting an unrelated individual who matched the evidence was less than 1 in 320 billion. For the first time, the unknown male Dina profile had a confirmed name, Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. But even after identifying him, investigators were left with questions that Dina couldn't answer. Police found no documented evidence that Mary knew Murray. They found no established relationship connecting him to her family. Authorities have described the murder as likely a crime of opportunity. Exactly where their paths crossed remains unknown. What Murray may have said or done when he encountered Mary is unknown. Investigators cannot ask him why she was targeted. They cannot confront him with the evidence. And there will never be a trial where those questions might have been explored. On February 10, 2026, nearly 62 years after Mary's death, Elmira police stood with prosecutors, federal investigators, partner organizations, and members of Mary's family and publicly announced the result. The department identified Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. as the person investigators concluded was responsible for Mary's sexual assault and murder. Police formally closed the case. Chief Kristen Thorne said that if Murray were still alive, prosecutors would seek to charge him with murder. But he had been dead for more than 2 decades. The investigation could finally answer who. It could never fully answer why. For Mary's older sister, Linda Galpin, the announcement ended a wait that had lasted most of her life. Linda had been 16 when Mary was killed. She was 78 when police finally stood before her with a name. Their parents had not lived long enough to see that day. After thanking the investigators and everyone who had helped bring the case to its conclusion, Linda expressed the one absence that could never be fixed. She wished her mother had been there. 62 years is difficult to understand when written as a number. It is easier to understand through everything Mary's family lost during that time. Birthdays passed. Investigators came and went. Technology changed. Children grew into adults. Adults became grandparents. People who had known Mary died without ever learning who had taken her life. And still, somewhere in evidence storage, pieces of the answer remained. A tiny amount of biological material, less than the eye could see, preserved long enough for science to become capable of reading what investigators in 1964 could not. There is one final point worth remembering. This story can easily become a story about Alfred Murray, about his grave, his DNA, his past, and how police finally identified him. But he should not be the person who remains at the center of it. Because before there was an evidence number, before there was a DNA profile, before a case file grew to thousands of pages, Mary Theresa Simpson was 12 years old. She played kick the can with neighborhood children. She skated through Elmira on metal wheels fastened to her shoes. She spent time with her sister. She visited relatives. And on one Sunday afternoon in 1964, she left expecting to come home again. For almost 62 years, her family waited for an answer. Science eventually gave them one. Not every question, not a confession, not a courtroom, but a name. And after generations of investigators refused to let the evidence disappear, the unknown man connected to Mary's clothing was unknown no longer. The FBI continues to request information from anyone who may know more about Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. and his past behavior. Whether that produces answers about anything beyond Mary's case remains to be seen. But Mary's case itself is no longer officially unsolved. After almost 62 years, the investigation is closed. And the name worth remembering is not the man detectives had to dig out of a grave. It is the girl whose evidence survived long enough to lead them there. Mary Theresa Simpson. 12 years old. A daughter, a sister, and a child whose family waited more than 6 decades for the truth.